Hi again. So hands down, one of my favorite texts to teach in the entire universe is The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. There's so much in this book that I think is super important. Um, and I love the way he writes. I think it's such an interesting book. It's very different from a lot of the stuff that we've read this semester in the sense that it's kind of a sociological study. Um, in a sense, it's an ethnography, so you get sort of a different kind of text with this one, and it also deals with a bunch of really important issues. One of the things you're going to do for your voice thread this week is watch a couple of pieces of slam poetry. And the one that I really love and think fits really well in with the Souls of Black Folk is called American Poem, and it's by a guy named Raz Baraka. So I've posted the YouTube link to this poem, and I posted a link to the lyrics to it as well, or the words. I would really strongly recommend that you check it out. It's so good. It's one of my favorite poems. Of all time. There's some language in it, obviously, but you should definitely check it out. So when we look at the Souls of Black Folk, what kind of questions are we dealing with? Remember that we're dealing largely with this expanding definition of humans, right? So before, back even during the Enlightenment, what it meant to be a human was to be a white male. Upper class person. And so with Marx, we've seen that definition expand to include lower class people. With Du Bois, we're going to see it expand to include people who are not white. And when we check out Virginia Woolf, we're going to see that definition expand to women too. The first and most obvious question we deal with when we look at the Souls of Black Folk is, what is the origin of racism in America, / in the Western world. Du Bois's text talks specifically about America, but we can look at race in the broader context too. We're going to look at some of the scientific justifications of racial inequality, and that term is in quotes because there are no scientific justifications for why for inequality between different races. Race is actually a social construct, so there's no scientific reason why there should be these differences, but that doesn't stop people from trying to make these really bad arguments. We're going to look at how we can characterize race relations in America after the Civil War. So we're going to look at the black experience, the white experience, how blacks and whites interact with each other. The big fundamental question we're dealing with is, how can we eradicate racism? And so that is going to be kind of looming in the background while we deal with this text. But because I think there's so much going on here, and I don't want to make it a text that's just about race, even though that's huge. That's most of what the text is about. Du Bois also has some really important things to say about education. So we're looking at the goals of an education, what they are and what they should be, and we're also talking about money and how financial success relates to happiness and the good life. One of my favorite lines from this text happens pretty early on, and W.B. Du Bois asks, how does it feel to be a problem? And so one of the things that we've seen so far this semester is that through the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, we've been able to discover truths by using a combination of reason and the scientific method. A lot of what gets uncovered doesn't actually qualify as a truth. So when we look at Du Bois, we'll see science, and I have science in quotes, used to justify social, political, and economic inequalities. It can be used to justify the enslavement and the mistreatment of certain groups of people. I have the words inferior and uncivilized in quotes here because we know that all humans are equal. There are no people in the world who are biologically inferior. We know that the word uncivilized is not a politically correct word to use. But that didn't stop people in the 19th century and back beyond that from trying to civilize people through the process of enslaving them. And colonialism is the name, so kind of the broad name that we use for the process by which Western nation states colonized a lot of the non-Western world, and the way that they justify it is that they plan on civilizing the savage. So I have this map of Africa, the continent of Africa, in 1914. And so what you want to look at here is how it's just been carved up by a bunch of different European countries. So you see in the middle here you've got Belgium owns the Congo. All of this gray stuff is owned by France. All of the red stuff is owned by Great Britain, right? Even Spain has little pieces and stuff. So again, what we call colonialism, that carving up of the non-Western world in order to, quote, civilize these people. One example I'll give you is, this isn't the only example of a text like this, but there's this essay that was published in 1855 by this guy named Arthur de Gobineau. And Gobineau popularizes this idea that differences between social classes are actually biological. And so he kind of inspired this scientific study of the biological roots of social distinction. So this is a terrible, awful text. He tries to give this science of history where he divides the world up into like basically three races and tries to explain the rise and fall of civilization. So he says you have the whites and the blacks and the yellows, and the blacks he calls them stupid and frivolous. But he says they have well-developed senses. He calls the yellows, we would say like the Hispanic and Asian people, he says that they crave mediocrity. And of course the white people he thinks are strong and intelligent and handsome. I already showed you a picture of this guy, but you can guess what race he is. And even among the whites, he distinguishes like a superior group that he calls the Aryans. And he says the way civilization happened was through superior races conquering inferior races. This is bunk. This is junk science. There's nothing scientific behind this at all. It's not true. But this is sort of the justification that people were using for racism throughout the 20th century. And I think even if you go to some crazy parts of the world today, there are still people who believe this stuff. So I'm just going to give you a really quick rundown of the history of slavery, just so you have, if it's been a while since you've taken history, just so you have this kind of background. Slavery, as we know it, actually dates way back to the ancient world. The Greeks had slaves. They took prisoners of war and used them as slaves. The Romans, of course, had a giant slaveholding society. Even Africans and Native Americans, some groups held slaves on really small scales. Typically, slaves were used as household servants. And depending on the civilization you're dealing with, they might have been given certain rights just in virtue of being human beings. But slavery kind of explodes in the 17th century in what we call the Atlantic slave trade. And I have this map that shows you where slaves are being exported from and where they're going. The reason for this is that colonies that we've colonized North America, and for a bunch of reasons, religious freedom, resources, whatever. What happens when the American colonies sort of crop up is that you have all these people who are trying to make a lot of money by cultivating crops that are really they require a lot of care, right? So cotton and coffee and tobacco and stuff like that. And they're lazy, right? The Europeans are just lazy, and they don't know how to handle these crops. So what they do is they begin enslaving Africans, shipping them to what will become the United States, Latin America, and that's what we call the Atlantic slave trade. And you look at a map like this, and you see all of the people who've been exported, and you just ask, like, how in the world could this have happened? Well, I mean, the fact is that people didn't think that non-whites were humans. So anyone who was seen as biologically less human was, people could totally justify enslaving them. So that's sort of the background of the Atlantic slave trade. We get the first slaves arriving in my home state of Virginia as early as 1619, and by 1820, there were millions of slaves throughout the U.S. Why are the slaves in the South and not in the North? Well, you can't grow the crops in the North, right? So cotton and coffee and tobacco and stuff like that they can't get grown in colder climates. So the northern part of the United States actually develops like a wage labor economy, while the South develops this grand scale slaveholding society where one person could own hundreds of slaves. One person could own hundreds of people. It's crazy to think about it. So we see these emancipation movements begin. Britain kind of gets the ball rolling where they have these abolitionist movements that are based on the idea of shared humanity, right? So people finally started realizing, like, we shouldn't enslave humans because we're all humans. And then in the 19th century, you see white Americans begin to resist slavery in larger numbers. So John Brown is your good example of the abolitionist who said, slavery, the only way we can end it is through violence. So he leads the Potawatomi Massacre and stuff like that. So you see people like this cropping up and getting a voice. So when Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860, he opposes the expansion of slavery into the newly acquired Western territories. He doesn't actually run on an anti-slavery platform. He just doesn't want to upset the balance in Congress. So all of the new territories that have applied for statehood, Lincoln doesn't want any of them to be slave states. And so the South secedes. The shots at Fort Sumter. In 1863, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which actually didn't free any slaves because they were all free in the North already, and the South didn't care about whatever Lincoln said. The war ends in 1865. The period after the Civil War is what we call Reconstruction, and the time frame that we put on it is kind of arbitrary, but this is where the government tries to rebuild the country after the war. And the effort of Reconstruction was focused on trying to bring the Southern states back into the Union, and on helping the former slaves adjust to their new lives as free men. So we see the Freedmen's Bureau established, African American schools, services that ease the transition. But the problem is the U.S. government officially declares Reconstruction over, and they pull out the Union troops. The Union troops had been there to act as like this buffer between the newly freed African Americans and the former slaveholders who were still pretty pissed off about losing the humans that they owned. And that leaves these newly freed African Americans really vulnerable to attacks by the Southern whites, who are still very racist because racism just doesn't go away overnight. And so they institute Jim Crow laws to debilitate and limit blacks in the South. Separate but equal becomes the norm. So I'm going to end that little history lesson here, and then I'll get on to talk about the souls of black folk.